This is Hector's quilt. Hector was from Cuba and had left during the Fidel regime and all that. He moved to San Francisco and worked at the university. Hector and I just became friends. And well, in San Francisco, Hector wouldn't necessarily do drag, but he would wear these beautiful velvet things. Oh, he would wear these flowing velvet robes and be more Egyptian-like. No makeup. Hector was just very flamboyant. He loved to dance. He loved to make Cuban coffee. I would go there every Saturday morning, and we would have Cuban coffee. He loved sewing and making dresses for women. On the quilt, you probably noticed that was Hector's signature. I had gotten a letter from Hector about a month before he died. He was writing to all of his friends to say goodbye and to not mourn him, but to have a party for him. And he signed the letter. So we just took that signature and gave it to a graphic artist friend to design the quilt. He just looked at it and said, "Let's take that signature and glitter it up." And we just wanted a very plain background because we could not put a lot of stuff from Cuba on it because he was still very upset about Cuba. Glitter because, well, he was just glitter. He was just out there. He was just. When you thought of Hector, you thought of glitter.
So, I came out of college in 1982. I moved to Washington, D.C. I probably had a year of solid joy. Great job at the Hyatt Hotel. 24 years old, and I remember seeing a Washington Blade newspaper and the word gay plague at the top of it. Honestly, gay plague. It was probably 1984, but the reason it sticks in my head is probably a month earlier. A friend of mine from Brazil who ran the All-American Boys store in Washington, D.C., died overnight. They probably called it pneumonia. But reading that headline and wondering about my friend Marco, and he's gone. And what happened? He was one of those people. And I'm not even sure he's an AIDS statistic. I'm not even sure he's a statistic because they didn't know what it was. And this was one person in Washington, D.C. Imagine that happening all over the country at the same time. And that was my first experience. That's when I knew it was real.
It was a terror. An absolute terror. And nobody knew what to do. What to say to each other, where to go for help. It was a very slow process for those of us that were threatened with it, and likely positive. Many didn't want to know, didn't test. Paranoia was really rampant, literally. It was an everyday trauma in San Francisco in those days. Very ill or gaunt or cozy lesion-covered AIDS patients would be in public, hobbling on canes or what have you, in a wheelchair. And I'm certain it's not unlike parts of Europe, during the 12th and 13th century, in the midst of the Black Death. I didn't test positive until 1989. I hadn't tested at all prior to that, out of deference for my lover at the time, Walt, who didn't want to know. It was was really not a wise decision. It was not wise at all. And he died after a brief illness in February of 1990 from pneumocystis, only 3 weeks. And then from there, I was kind of on my own to deal with the hundreds of people that were passing every month.
The mother of the quilt. They've called me that for many, many years. It's because, well, I've been with the quilt since day one, and I'm just out of control about taking care of it. And I've always called the quilt my boys because, well, most of my friends were on it. I'm a big gay man lover. I mean, I am. People are on me about, oh, you know, other people died. I said, I know. But what hit me were all of my friends, my boys. So that's why I called it that. I told somebody, I go, they're all my boys now. It's not just the people I know, but anybody who's on the quilt, anything. That's just the way I feel about it. And taking care of them, kind of, and their pasts, so that people don't say bad things about them, because they were wonderful men. In the 80s, I had 4 roommates in a house of 4 other adults, 4,800 square feet. And because my roommates were gay, I had access to the gay community, the Pride celebration. And I was involved in some plays and skits and other things. And one of my roommates, Jerry, actually developed HIV and AIDS complications. And he eventually died at home in our house. And we were all there, his friends, his family, and it was very good. So if death can be considered a good thing for someone suffering, that's what it was. He knew we were all there, and we went by his wishes. We honored his wishes to die home. But since then, most of the people I've known with HIV are long-term survivors of HIV. In fact, it's amazing how healthy several of them are, and if Jerry had not had some other complications, he would have been among that group.
So when I first became a nurse in 1996, my first bedside job was at Lovay House. And initially it was for those anticipating to die from AIDS. And when I think about my time there, okay, so there was this one client, his name was Howard. Along with AIDS, he was a paraplegic, mostly affected by MS, multiple sclerosis. And we spent a lot of time with Howard because he had deep wounds in his sacrum. And we would have to do his wound care every shift. And so when we were doing his wound care, he would talk to us a lot about his experience with substance use. Talk to us about his emotions, about being positive, and just not having family to go to. Throughout our interactions with Howard, I think this is when I first realized the importance of a touch or a hug. And so when we weren't doing wound care, we would give Howard a hug or a kiss on the forehead, sort of like flirting in a way, right? To bring about a human emotion, you know? But that connection, just touching or even talking, can remove everything else, serving as a perimeter, a boundary surrounding HIV.
My good friend Jock was probably positive when I met him in 88 or 89. I can't quite remember because it was so long ago, but at that time what happened with people, it was kind of like, oh, remember back in June or July last year, prior to the time that there were vaccines for coronavirus, that if somebody got COVID, you thought, oh my God, they're gonna die, you know? Which is exactly the cultural context for what was going on with HIV and AIDS in the 80s. It's such a different world now than it was in the early 90s. I mean, There were no smartphones, there was no internet, but there was no treatment that would keep somebody alive if they got it. So if somebody had an opportunistic infection, maybe they would live, maybe they wouldn't. Nobody knew. Nobody had any idea how to stop this thing. So when people got it, it was absolutely terrifying because they died.
Reagan refused to speak the word AIDS. He refused to speak the words. He refused to acknowledge it because in Reagan's mind, this was only affecting homosexuals, and who gave an oomph about them? Well, keep in mind that Reagan was the one who aligned the Republican Party with the fundamentalists, with the Christian right. And so that makes perfect sense, right? That Reagan would turn his back, and if they were dying, then so be it. You know, in his mind, this was like God's wrath upon them. It was horrific. Well done. So let's see if we can say the facts. So the facts are that when they moved to New York in 1960.
In 1964.
Okay, well in 1964, when they moved to New York, Dad started really realizing he was gay.
Well, Dad always knew he was gay.
Okay, well, he always knew he was gay, but being more, how would you say it?
Active.
Active, that's one way to put it.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to be active in New York City than in Memphis, Tennessee.
And so at some point before we were born, actually, Mom knew he was gay. So there was sort of that coming out to his wife pretty early on.
But he really wanted to be a dad.
He really wanted to be a dad, and he really loved Mom. Erin, is it your understanding that he told her, or like she found out somehow? I don't remember.
Oh, I think he told her at first, but then it like wasn't a constant in the beginning.
I think so too.
Yeah, so it wasn't a constant. I think it would come and go.
Yeah, and I think it was like sort of like the 60s, you know, and I think there was some faint notion of it being like an open marriage, like a free love kind of thing.
I don't think Mom had that understanding.
No, but then she was like, you know, no, this is not working.
Yeah, and if you were to ask me today, I would say, oh, my dad was my best friend. But I hated my dad for being gay. I hated both of my parents for him being gay. And I think the difficult part is when Dad moved out, he moved into this place that was ridiculous with a man who was ridiculous, and I hated it. But I was also 8, you know, and it was very difficult for him, and he felt guilty, but he was, I guess, living his truth.
I was about 32 when I went to the NAMES project, but about 4 or 5 years prior to that is when I first started to notice the epidemic. A friend of mine had gotten sick. This is before they called it AIDS. They called it GRID, Gay-Related Immune Deficiency. All my life I've hung around gay men. I worked at Macy's and in cosmetics, and I worked in the theater at night, so you can't find more gay men than that. But a friend, David Calgaro at Macy's, started to get sick. That's when he was always the boy that was sick. The nurse would send him to the hospital all the time. I would go visit him. That's before they had the word GRID, I think. We just knew he was sick. But, you know, my friends were some of the very first to get sick in San Francisco, and, you know, probably some of the first to die there. But that's when all the nurses were in moon suits, you know. They were so afraid. They had these full-on suits with the masks and the respirators, all the nurses, and they tell me, you need to put this on. And I said, well, is that for them or for me? And they said, well, for you. And I said, honey, we can get it that easily. And I touched them, you know? I said, there, huh? Now you got it too. I mean, maybe we could, but I figured if we could get it that easy, we're all goners anyway. So that's when I started going back to the hospitals all the time to visit my friends. And that was kind of my way of doing something before I found the quilt.
So this is the quilt I made It was 2 years after Walter passed away. And you notice in the center is a piece of the needlepoint. It was to be a pillow cover, and Walt had been working on it maybe about 3 years. So I put the needlepoint on a field of dark green because that's a typical color that Walt used to always paint our living room walls. Walt and I lived together 11 years. We met on January 12th, 1979. So it would have been our 11th anniversary, the day I took him to the hospital at Mount Zion Hospital in San Francisco. He was born on the 5th of July. I always called it almost Independence Day. And he would be 70 years old now. I first met Walt when he relocated to San Francisco, and he told me he wasn't quite ready at the time to settle down because he had just gotten to San Francisco. Those were the days before the plague. Yeah, it was tough. The quote at the bottom, "Love is the boss," is from the song "The Boss" by Diana Ross. And that's the song that we used to always dance together to on the dance floor. That's where we first met. We met on the dance floor.
When you go back and look at HIV and caretaking in the 80s, there were these teams, care teams that were formed. I mean, doctors just could not do it all. Nurses couldn't do it all. I mean, there was just so much involved. Lesbians kind of had to form care teams because a lot of these men's families just would not come and take care of them. And even if they had a partner, that partner was usually sick at the same time. So we had systems of cooking for other people and taking them to their doctor's appointments and really coming over and spending time with them so that the partner could take a break. And you were emotionally exhausted. You still had to work because you had to hold your own job down. And especially during their transition to dying, that could go on for weeks. And someone had to be with them all the time. But we just went through every day knowing we were going to have to take care of Dawn, or Martin, or John, or Hector, in his case.
So, in 1990, I was 15. And my mom, we were in London, New Jersey. And she found out that she was HIV positive. And she got tested because my stepfather was a intravenous drug user. As a child, I just thought he was a bad alcoholic. But all of his friends were dying and he was looking like crap. And I didn't understand intravenous drug use at the time. My mother was a teenage mother. She was 17 years older than me. I was 15 at the time. And she told me she was positive. That's when I first found out about HIV and AIDS. But we developed a close relationship. I would say I became her confidant in a way. But interestingly, my mother was very spiritual. And she only believed in her faith. She was gonna pray it away. Pray the AIDS away, right? Oh my God. And, throughout the years, I would just watch her not seek care and just listen to her pray, pray, pray. My mother prayed morning, noon, and night. But she wouldn't take the medicine. And her privacy became secrecy. But her secret didn't help me help her. Because now, I'm in the secret with her.
I remember the first time Jacques had an opportunistic infection, which was around 91 or 92. He used to come over to my house, and he'd hang out on my couch with his partner of umpteen years. I said, well, what's going on? He said, I'm scared, I'm sick. His boyfriend said, no, you're fine. But at this time, you were always kind of on edge, like if somebody sneezed, or they said they didn't feel good, or they broke a sweat or something. It was gripping. And we didn't know if they were gonna die because there weren't any treatments. I remember when he went into the hospital for 2 weeks, you couldn't go see him. They wouldn't let you in. He was quarantined. They wore hazmat suits. It was terrifying. You never knew who was gonna say, I'm sick. You didn't know what your circle of friends was gonna look like from one day to the next day. And these were really vibrant people, so it was just terrifying and such an uncertain time for people.
So it was an extremely promiscuous time, and again, I didn't know any other way. And you certainly didn't think the virus was going to be like this big pandemic. Oh my God, millions of people dying. But at the time, you started to wonder, okay, maybe it's bad drugs they're taking. They're taking poppers, so maybe it's in the poppers. So you started to think it was something related to this community. You had no idea that it had anything to do with transmitting fluids between folks. That just didn't occur to you. And honestly, we didn't have Facebook. We didn't have the internet per se. It was mouth to mouth, newspaper to newspaper. For the time, we were all hanging on to this newspaper. Imagine a Washington Blade 12-page newspaper produced by the community on a weekly basis that by 1990, the back 6 pages were filled with obituaries.
I don't know if you've ever heard the phrase, there are friends for a reason, friends for a season, and then there are friends for life. Well, I guess my friend Frank and I were either friends for a reason or a season. I think probably more a season. So we were really, really tight for 3, 4, maybe 5 years, and then college ended, and everybody went their separate ways. And Frank ended up in New York. He wanted to be on Broadway, and so I would go out to visit him, and one night we went out to dinner, and he said,
Mindy?
that was my nickname. He said,
Mindy? I need to tell you something.
I said, yeah, of course. I mean, you can tell me anything. He said,
I have AIDS.
I mean, just like that. There were no physical signs at all at the time. But then again, I was not very savvy. And so my immediate response was, no, you mean you're HIV positive.
No. I have AIDS.
You know, when I first made my panels, I thought I was making them for other people, And then I realized I was making them for me, for what I was going through. I've actually made over 120 panels, and I have about 300 people that I know who have died. I mean, sometimes I feel like I'm 5 years old because nobody knows me from when I was younger, Now there are people who have known me for a little longer, but there was a time when everybody I knew was dead. And I mean, I was shocked if you didn't have AIDS, because through the 80s and 90s, everybody I knew was sick.
When I moved to San Francisco, it was my goal to hook up with an AIDS project there. I had talked to Jerry's brother. Jerry's brother lives in San Francisco. So we talked about it, and I started discussing the design with him. I think he's the only one I really discussed the design with. No one seemed tied to it one way or another. Yeah, Yeah, so I found their address, showed up one day, and started volunteering. So while I was working on my quilt, I was helping others work on theirs as well. That's what I started doing. So I would work, and then a couple days a week, I would volunteer at the Dance Project. Jerry's quilt wasn't a quick thing, so one of the reasons I really enjoy volunteering is because I don't really worry about making mistakes because I feel like, you can always figure it out, right? So I'm not worried about that type of stuff. So I can help people put their vision into practice, and I love that. I love that feeling of helping someone take what they have in their mind and putting it onto a panel.
I helped my friend David make a quilt for his partner Ken. And David's story is a hard one. He was a Baptist minister in North Carolina, very closeted, and he had a wife and a child. He decided that he was going to leave it all, and so he moved to Charlotte, North Carolina to come out, and as fate would have it, the first man that he had an encounter with had HIV and didn't tell him. And then the next man that he dated was Ken, who also had HIV, but David was as genuine a person as I had ever met. He was literally the type of person who would treat the President of the United States and the janitor exactly the same. He always spoke from the heart. And in '92, I had moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, and shortly after I got there, I got involved in various related AIDS projects, but David just kind of kept popping up, and so I didn't quite know it at the time, but his partner was dying. But he and I got talking, and I told him some stories of quilts that I'd made. Not AIDS quilts, just regular quilts. And after Ken passed, he asked me if I would make a panel for him. And so that's how I got started with making the quilts.
So there was a bulletin board post for the Names Project in New York. And I was like, hey, I'm a carpenter. This is in my wheelhouse. So I went over to 13th Street, the Gay and Lesbian Center, talked to the guys setting up the place, made arrangements, showed up a couple days later with a screw gun, we built tables. And after that, I would just show up every day after work, stay till 9, leave, come back the next day. And at that time, it was really just whoever showed up, but it was never not busy. It was always busy. And there would be 12 or 16 people in the room at a time. As soon as someone left, someone came in. And generally, it was that typical, all right, here are the sizes. What did you bring? Okay, take a look at the fabrics over there. What do you want to say? Do you want it to be vertical, or do you want it to be horizontal? How do you want to honor the person? And after you have that information, you would go, all right, here's what we have in stock. And the mood in the room was, well, dependent upon the day. There were folks that were obviously very involved in their grief, but then there were gay men that were all about celebrations with their panels.
He was a librarian.
He loved being a librarian.
Yeah, loved people, loved helping people.
I mean, there were people from his library who would say things like, I would not be where I am today without reading.
Yeah, and he deeply wanted to impart on us his style of reading. It was like no other.
One thing, he always loved to read some sort of children's story, the night before Christmas, and he would always read it under this gigantic tree.
Yes, with a bazillion white lights.
Like a gazillion strands.
Yes, it was always white. It was never colored lights.
And he would always read at least one.
Sometimes two.
Yeah, sometimes three.
Yeah, so if it was a long one, it was just one, like the Polar Express.
Ooh. And I mean, he didn't always want to be a librarian. I mean, his brother is like, I think 9 years older than him. And he was a physician. So he wanted to do that very, very badly. He wanted to be a doctor.
He wanted to be straight.
To be straight. Well, he wanted to be like, quote, normal. I mean, this was Memphis, Tennessee in the 60s, you know? So he really wanted to be all that. And he really tried to be all that. And he did love Mom. I do think they had a really nice relationship in a lot of ways.
When I think about Mom, I recall my mom being a natural woman. And what I mean by natural is she didn't need a lot of accessories to make herself visible. Natural in the sense that she didn't put chemicals in her hair. And no, that was not common. In the 80s and 90s, women of color, majority of black women, would relax their hair. Some would say a plain Jane, but just very beautiful in her natural state. And she didn't have a loud or boisterous voice. Calm and soothing. Someone I can go to or you could go to if you had a concern. And she would just talk or coach you through it.
Jock was just fearless. I mean, there's just no other way to say it, right? In 1992, he had his first complications with HIV. He was sick, he was in the hospital for 2 weeks. Now, in 92, nobody was talking about the virus, but nobody was saying, I have it. Jock wrote an email to his coworkers telling them, I'm not gonna hide this. I'm not ashamed of this, and I'm gonna be upfront about it. And that is such a brave act at the time, because you could be fired for being gay, right? Fired for just being who you were. That's how incredible he was. Look, we had a government that was willing to let tens of thousands of people die instead of putting money towards research or finding treatment. Reagan wouldn't say the word. I mean, nobody would say HIV. Nobody would say AIDS, right? Rock Hudson died, and initially they said he died of a respiratory illness. No, he died of pneumonia, and he was HIV positive. Nobody talked about this. I mean, that's one of the things I think that's really different now. You didn't talk about this, but Jock did, because he was fearless, and he lived a brilliant life.
ACT UP was a huge part of my life. These were the people with those silence equals death signs during protests. ACT UP stood for AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. By the 90s, the science was coming around. You were starting to understand what a virus was. You were starting to understand that it could mutate. You were starting to understand that without medicine, we were in big trouble. Hence the protests. Oh my God, the die-ins. We used to hold these huge die-ins. Living in DC and going to New York, Baltimore, Philadelphia, New York corridor, just to protest. Funerals would turn into protests. Ronald Reagan never said the word AIDS. He sat in the White House, watched us protest, watched us die, and just never said anything. There was no funding in our own government. We were pissed, and we were watching these beautiful people die. So we got militant, and I did some crazy stuff. I threw red paint at buildings, threw balloons filled with blood, and I did some crazy stuff. But at the time, it was all justified. I can understand the war protests. In fact, that's what, to me, that's what AIDS has been like. We went to war in those years. In those decades, it was an absolute war.
David's was one of first quilt panels I made. I love David Kilgara. David and I loved I Love Lucy. So that's where that came from. The red heart is satin. The pink is a ripstop. It's the material they use for flags and stuff like that. We worked together at Macy's, and I was not that good a friend of his before he got sick, but then I got some time off to go visit him in the hospital. And I kept trying to get the other girls from the cosmetics area to go and visit him, but they wouldn't. They were afraid. And I got really angry with those girls, because he was just such a fabulous guy. David and I always watched I Love Lucy together in the hospital. We put on I Love Lucy, and I'd climb in bed with him and just hug him, stuff like that. As a regular guy, David used to love to go dancing. I mean, it was the 70s and 80s, so, wild time, right? But he really was openly gay. He was a cheerleader. And he was in the marching band. That's the very first person I knew who died of AIDS.
I remember I found a card for a gay father support group. Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it was on his desk. And so I asked Mom, I was like, Mom, what is this? And she was like, oh crap. And so she had to explain to me that she was still with someone who was gay. And, she was really kind of a deer in the headlights about it. And so she said, I think you should ask your father about this. And then Dad said, I have friends who are men. And, he explained it as best he could for like a 9-year-old, I don't know. But I have a bit of a different experience because I did hear their fights a lot. And I felt sort of a relief when he left.
So this symbol, you notice the blue triangle in the lower right-hand corner of the quilt panel, represents my affinity for all things Egyptian. Pyramids, the ox symbol being symbol of endless life, so to speak. And somewhere in the applied portions of the fabric is a piece of jewelry, which is a Tiffany Favreau glass scarab that I used to wear around my neck. And I included it as kind of a farewell gift. Walt guided me through the worst and darkest days of the HIV and AIDS epidemic. What do I remember about him most? Walt's big blue eyes, his beauty. He was an especially gorgeous man.
My experience with making a quilt panel was I had just told David to go home and to gather the things that he really felt captured the essence of Ken. And we talked a lot about how he loved to garden, that Ken did, and he talked about pansies. And so I told him, well, that's no problem. I could use fabric flowers. I was married back in the day, a long time ago now, of course, and I had sewn fabric flowers, fabric petals, onto my gown, because I had made my own gown. And so I told him about that, and I said, I could just sew pansies all around, and he said, well, that would be wonderful. And so we did that, and of course, the hardest thing, and maybe you can appreciate this as a seamstress, was when he started bringing me leather. And I was like, of course it had to be leather, and with rhinestones, no less. So I was like, oh Lord, but you can see we have these 2 letters sealed in plastic, and those are David's letters about the panel. We have the dates of birth and the dates of death, which is pretty traditional. Black piece of fabric for the back of it. And Charlotte, North Carolina is where he and Ken met and spent most of their time together. And that is actually an outfit of Ken's. The only other thing that I would note is that picture of David right in the center. And Ken and David in that heart. I found that to be very poignant. And of course all of the pansies, because I love the garden.
It was January of '92, and that year I had gotten a Christmas card from Frank. And I thought, he always sends me a Christmas card. And so I called his house, and a man answered the phone. And, I thought it was Frank. I said, Frank, it's Mindy. I'm calling to check up on you. How are you doing? And there was a very long pause, and it was his partner, Jimmy. And Jimmy said,
No, Mindy, it's Jimmy. Frank's not here.
I said, oh, well, when can I call back? When's a good time? And Jimmy said,
He's in the hospital.
and that's when the seriousness of the situation began to sink in. And so I asked, okay, well, when is he coming home? And there was another very long pause, and Jimmy said,
He's not coming home.
I said, okay, I am going to get a plane ticket, and I will be out there as soon as I can. Jimmy said,
No. He doesn't want anyone seeing him the way he is now. He wants you to remember him the way he was the last time you saw him.
and so I had to respect his wishes. And he was just shy of his 40th birthday, and he was looking good. And I think he had found a true satisfaction with his life, but it wasn't meant to be.
Well, the quilt was conceived in 1985 by Cleve Jones. What had happened was that the 1,000 deaths had happened in the Castro. So Cleve had decided he was going to do a march. He took Harvey Milk's bullhorn. He was going to go down to the Federal Building, and everyone was going to carry one of these placards. And each of the placards had the name of somebody who had died from AIDS. So we kind of pasted them up under the Federal Building, and Cleve took a step back and said, wow, it looks like a quilt. Well, that's the inspiration of the quilt. About a year and a half later, he had his first meeting, but Cleve didn't even go, because he said he thought it was going to be a failure. So I went to that first meeting in June 1st, 1987. Within about a week, we had the place on Market. There were about 6 of us. We met in a dark warehouse on Market in Castro. That's where it all began. It did take a while to get going. I remember I wrote a wish list. Sewing machines, fabric, thread, just the stuff that you need for sewing. Maybe some computer stuff too. I put down popsicles. So people were bringing in popsicles. But we shared that facility with the March on Washington people. They all thought we were crazy, you know? You're gonna bring out a quilt? Mm-hmm. You're gonna put it where? But anyway, by October we had 1,920 panels, and we went to Washington, D.C. for the inaugural display.
In 1996, my mom began to become extremely ill. She took ill, as people would say. And like today, I say this all the time. HIV doesn't have a look, but AIDS does. And so when I speak to people that are HIV positive, I say, do you want to talk about stigma? If you don't take this medicine, you're going to look like stigma. You're going to look like AIDS. AIDS has a look. HIV doesn't have a look. And when she was developing advanced AIDS, just looking unhealthy. She also developed hepatitis C. Eventually, she wanted to treat the HIV, because at the time she was scared she was gonna die. But she belabored both diseases for so long that she couldn't tolerate the hepatitis C treatment and has psoriasis of the liver. And so I became a motherless child prematurely in 1998.
So when he moved out, that's when he moved to Memphis.
Yeah, his time in Memphis was mostly bad, in my opinion. He was at the height of his drinking at the time, and Lisa and I would go between living with Mom and living with him. And he was living with a man who was also an alcoholic, who I think is the one who gave him AIDS.
Oh, do you think so?
Well, he slept around a lot, and I wasn't old enough to talk about it, and I wasn't aware enough to talk about it with him, so I guess I'll never know his perspective of it, but I saw a lot of it.
Cleve decided on the 3 foot size, 7 foot, because that's the size of the grave. So that's why we did it. We were burying our dead. We were laying down our dead. We were gonna go to Washington. We were gonna lay down our dead in front of the White House and embarrass them into doing something. So it was purely an activist thing. It was not about becoming a memorial. We were gonna do it once and never do it again. We were gonna come home. That was gonna be it. I put my address on my first 2 panels because I thought, oh God, these queens, what will they do with it, I wanted my panels back. But so, the public really forced us into becoming what we had not intended to be. And the reason it became the 12 by 12 is we just started to get a few panels in one night, and we were just like, what are we gonna do with them all? So we played with them on the floor and said, that looks like a good size, We can fit 8 of them in there. It wasn't anything bigger than that. People always say, oh, you guys are so organized, but it really had nothing to do with us. It was just something that just kind of happened.
I was with an AIDS project up until the first quilt presentation in Central Park, New York. That was the goal of the workshop. And I participated as a panel layer outer because they all had to be kind of unfolded, undone, sort of military style. It was a nice little ceremony. And then I stayed on for a little bit longer to help prepare the quilts to go to Washington. And in the park, there were easily 1,000 panels. It was a big deal. We thought it was a big deal. And then we got to Washington, and it was a speck in the ocean. And seeing the quilts in Washington was, oh. Ay, 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 ay. I think that was the moment for me to go, okay. It's now okay for me to acknowledge this and just be sad, just to scale it. Being from a small Texas town of 1,200 and then attending a small Catholic university of 1,200 and always knowing I was gay and always kind of being out on a don't ask, don't tell kind of basis. It's hard to explain how much being in New York actually meant to me. To be in the company of this big ass fucking group of gay men and just having that in my life was just so amazing. And to have it all abbreviated by AIDS just felt very cruel at the time.
Dad's intervention was in '83. So Erin and I were switching on between living with Mom and living with Dad. And one summer, I was supposed to go back to Dad's. And I said, I'm not going to drive back with him. He drinks, he smokes pot. I'm not going to do it. And Mom was like, wow, yeah, I mean, he's probably an alcoholic.
Yeah. On that trip from Memphis and to Richmond, he drank the entire 19-hour drive, and he did drugs the entire drive, and he didn't stop the car.
Yeah, and it was really bad. And so we intervened on him that summer, and he was pissed. He was not going to have it, but it didn't take him long. He threw a fit, he screamed and cried, and it made us all feel bad. And then he said, okay, all right, fine. And he did a 30-day inpatient treatment center. And he was completely sober after that. He never drank after that.
Yeah, from June of '83.
And that was the beginning, I would say, of the real healing for our family.
Our father went to the hospital. And I remember her having her head in the wall, in the corner of the wall, in the admitting room, while we were waiting for her bed. And I'm just like, Mom, why are you over here? And she said, I just feel as if everyone's staring at me. And I said, for what? For why? And she said, they're going to think that I was promiscuous. And so she stigmatized herself. And although I believe my mother was a living angel, the only thing that she herself can associate with that illness was something that had to do with immoral behavior.
In the fall of '93, Jock started to get sick, kind of sick where you don't get better. So his mom came from New York to take care of him, because nobody else could. Nobody else would. I mean, there was no care. She was just mom, She fluffed his pillows for him, and then he fluffed at her for not fluffing his pillows quite right. And, she cooked and she cleaned. She nursed him with a wet rag on the forehead kind of thing. And they laughed. I mean, I think that she just enjoyed every minute she could get with him. I remember when Jock started to have dementia. Watching them together, it was not a heavy atmosphere of dread. It was an atmosphere of togetherness and a celebration of love.
Jerry had so many beautiful silk vintage ties he used to wear at work. He liked to look good, always wearing his ties. He was very much a tie guy. And he would always wear a white shirt and a nice jacket, and he had some amazing suits. And these beautiful ties, if you look closely, the panel is actually made up of his ties. So what I did was I sort of opened them up and sewed them together until they were the size I needed. And they're all silk. So when I was making the panel, I arranged the ties in a way that kind of looks like a fan, and it fills up the whole space. So when I finished the panel, I'm just not very good at embroidery, so I had the panel sent off to get the embroidery professionally done. So the same thing that they do with Letterman's jackets or logo sort of stuff that people have sewn on. So it's just a type of stitching, but done with a really good machine.
Yeah.
I just didn't have that sort of skill. When I had finished the panel, I had all of his friends and family put their signature and a little message to him on it. I miss you. That was my message to him.
It's healing. It's a healing journey. When you're working with someone on a panel, it's sacred ground. There is a spiritual aspect of this. So you're recognizing that you're in this sacred place, and quilt making is actually a lot like the Jewish tradition of sitting Shiva. Because in most denominations, in most faiths, they're gone. You know, the funeral, it might last an hour, and then they're gone. And then in the Jewish tradition, you sit for 7 days, and you mourn. And making a quilt panel is a lot like that. You have to be ready to do it. It really is a sacred aspect of this. I think it's important to acknowledge the necessity of this kind of ceremony for someone who's lost their life to AIDS. Which I think goes back to what it meant to be gay in the 80s. Because in the 80s, all of those with very few exceptions, the people who were gay were living double lives. They were living very closeted lives. And so I believe the heart of the quilt was this need to have a physical embodiment of that person. You know, to say out loud and proud, this person lived. This person was real. This person was loved. And they had hopes and dreams and passions. And the panel could make them palpable, visceral, touched. You could touch it and you can feel it. And it gave them a life after death, in a way. And that is so powerful.
Erin, how do you feel you took the news, when you found out you had HIV?
I feel like it was very difficult for him. My gut reaction is he thought it was payback.
Like, he felt he was being punished?
Well, he never said that. I mean, I never asked, but I feel like that's how he felt.
I have friends all over this country, like myself and my partner, who have PTSD, who are guilt survivors, who really, it upsets me that I can sit here at a table and I want to tell a story about somebody from Philadelphia, and I can visualize the person and I can't come up with a name. And the names are just gone, like they're literally, there were so many so quickly, and they're just gone. And it's heartbreaking. It's weird for us to be at this age. There should be a lot more guys in their mid-50s in Wilmington right now. There should be more doctors. There should be more lawyers. In DC, you really noticed. Any major city, you really noticed. San Francisco got wiped out. Just wiped out. And you sort of feel you're the lucky one. I know hundreds of men who died. Literally, a normal person doesn't go to a lot of funerals. I can go through pictures and it's just so sad. It's unbelievable. It's just unbelievable.
I think the process for David making the quilt was cathartic. I think it was cathartic. And I don't want to, he's passed now too of AIDS, so I don't want to put words in his mouth, but, I know the release, and I feel that there must have been a weight was lifted. And the reason I feel that is because afterwards, he was free to start a new relationship, and he was with that partner for 16 years before he died. I know how very much making that quilt panel had meant to him. And I know it was a labor of love. I mean, all the panels are labors of love. But I think this picture here really sums it up. Captures his heartbreak. Captures even a little bit of anger too. You can't lose someone in this crisis without there being anger there. There's anger there, and there's rage. Not just against the virus, but politics and the senselessness of it. It's his face. His face really holds that for me.
I can't tell you the year, but I was living in Washington, D.C., and I had gone to see the quilt at the mall. And it just took your breath away. I mean, it just covered the whole thing. And so I wandered up and down the aisles. And that's when I first decided, oh, I need to do this for Frank. And I think I was a busy enough person that even though it was an intention, I didn't necessarily follow through. And then someone in our social circle, I don't remember who exactly, said, oh, well, I'm sure someone's already made a panel for Frank. And so that kind of enabled me to put it on the back burner even more if I thought, oh, he's been memorialized, that's good. And I just never made the effort to verify until they did a quilt workshop here in Wilmington, actually. And somebody said, well, there's a registry, like, you can go look. And I went, oh. And then when I looked, there was nothing. And so I said to myself, okay, now it's time to fulfill this promise that I made to myself and to him, that I would memorialize him in that way.
Losing Walt was pretty horrific. And realizing I was alone again after 11 years. I mean, the hospital staff, the doctors, guided me really incredibly sensitively. They made it clear to me what was happening to Walt's condition so that I could make an informed decision. And before that, he had always said, if I ever get sick, I just want it to be over quickly. And then he kind of had a change of heart in the middle of it. And he wanted to get better. And he wanted to go home. And he missed our cat, Trouble. I mean, I visited many other close friends that were dying in the hospital too, but none of it compared to having to terminate the life support of my partner of 11 years.
Hector gets sick in, I'm trying to remember. He gets sick at 85. And because he was just so angry about being sick, he did not respond well to medicine. He was so angry that this would happen to him, that this was how he was going to end his life, being a gay man, dying of AIDS, instead of Hector just being ill, He felt that he was losing every ounce of what he was meant to be. Hector had left Cuba during a very difficult time, came over here, started a new life, had a lot of fun, was well liked by everybody. And I can still see him standing in that doorway, smoking a cigarette. Hector's last days were in his apartment. He wanted to die at home. But he didn't feel angry when he died. I think he died in peace. He grabbed my hand and he said,
Thank you for being there.
he was able and conscious enough for that. And he wanted Cuban coffee. He could not keep anything down, but we made him Cuban coffee. He sipped at it, and then he slipped away.
His mother and I are still in touch 25 years later. Jack died in December of 1994. Over his bed, he had a crazy quilt. So his mother, in a way, tried to memorialize him and made a crazy quilt. She had never made a quilt before. But on this quilt is Hector's Jock's life, from cradle to grave. This is a romper. I know this to be true. This is part of a romper that she made for him when he was an infant. Jock was a quintessential Renaissance man. He was a classical violinist. Oh, he could cook like a crazy fool, and he danced like nobody's business. There he is, down there in the corner, playing his violin. He loved art. He was a collector. Artworks of all sorts hung around his apartment. So there he is playing his violin with his Maxfield and Parrish brother. Yeah, his mother used to travel with this quilt. She's 95 now, so she doesn't travel with it anymore, but this is her tribute to a young man who was fearless, brilliant, funny, kind, and so full of love.
So, when you came into the Broadway house, quilts were in a rotunda. It's like a big open gallery space. But I don't think I recognized the importance of the quilts at that time. I was a new nurse, just probably focusing on not making a mistake. And I was going through my own trauma. But when I decided to do my quilt, I just did what I do every day, and that's to allow her memory to represent those that are going through the same circumstances. And also to speak to the disproportionate rate in regards to Black women. And so when I decided to do her quilt, I just made sure that I did my best to create it in her silhouette, in her image. And I also added some remnants that brought her joy, which was singing, and her spirituality helped her cope. And then there's the jewelry. Now, my mom wasn't the one to wear stones or diamonds or pearls, but, you know, she still wore jewelry. Additionally, colors that represented the earth tone, the brown and the orange, because it just represents warmth to me, you know?
I did this one. It was great. He was an artistic guy. I remember he would sit in his room for hours and listen to all kinds of music. He loved music, all the latest books and pop culture. When people asked him what he did, he would say, "What do I do to make money?" Or, "What do I do to live my life?" If I remember correctly, he did accounts payable or receivable, something like that for the local paper, the Oregonian. But he would always describe his work as what he did to live his life. He did hairdressing at the opera, and when I met him, we were roommates, and we had a ton of adventures, like riding camels, or having different traveling pianists come and play the baby grand we had in the house.
Another adventure I remember is when Jerry would have the gay square dancing troupe over. And he would choreograph numbers in the attic. One time, they danced to Stop in the Name of Love. So, I had to make Supreme themed outfits for Nick. And it was a lot of fun.
When I made Frank's quilt, I had to learn all the rules. I learned that it is meant to be the size of a grave. So 6 foot by 3 foot. And that was very moving for me to know that that was unintentional. And I wanted a neutral background because, I knew I was going to slap all this stuff on it. Did it need to be that neutral? Well, probably not, but it worked. On the bottom left, you will see the great state of California. And that star is approximately where Fresno is. That's where he grew up, and that's where we met. And, well, I knew I wanted a picture of Frank. And so I was going through my old photos, and I found his headshot. And I wondered to myself, all right, how am I going to keep most of the quality in this photo? And so I was scrolling through Shutterfly, or one of those websites where you can put somebody's face on a pillow, or you can put somebody's face on an apron, or you can make a cloth calendar, and you can make a dish towel. So I took Frank's face and I put it on a dish towel, and well, it retained most of the quality, and so that gave me a piece of fabric to put on the quilt.
In September of 1995, I fell into a fever of 106 degrees. And I probably could not have survived if they had not hit upon the correct antibiotic cocktail to take me out of whatever it was that was causing those fevers. But I had a peculiar outlook, I felt at the time. I didn't share it with too many people. But I had a certain calmness, believe it or not. In that with so many incredibly talented, wonderful friends, talented people, artists, executives, it was striking everybody down, regardless of your place in life or career or what have you. And I felt I was in marvel. I felt I was in good company. And if I was chosen to pass away from HIV, I really wasn't that terrified of it. I felt like I was in marvelous company, a remarkable fraternity.
Craig Riddle was a guy my age, grew up town next door. This is all rural Texas. And we met at a mutual friend's at a Christmas party in Paris, Texas. And he was already studying university in Italy. And I was about to go over to Italy to study for my junior year. And instantly we were like, yeah, I'll be seeing you in Italy. And we kind of lost touch pre-cell phone age, even though we both ended up living in New York. And so it was maybe 1 or 2 years before I'd even learned he had passed away from AIDS. And in Italy, I was often country mouse, and he was the city mouse. And he would show me around, and he could speak Italian. And you could say that he was the first of my many mentors, because he taught me stuff. He was an art history major, and he would go, "This is how you look at art in Italy." And that it's all about opening doors. And it's funny, I don't think either of us ever even imagined an ongoing romantic. But I always thought we'd see each other again. Given that we grew up 3 miles apart, I thought we'd just run into each other. But we never did. It was just that one semester in Italy.
Frank would holler over that his face got turned into a dish towel. And you will see a clown because apparently he had a running gag with his New York friends about hating clowns. And you will also see a playbill because he went to the theater as much as he could afford, and he had a bookshelf completely filled with playbills. How he could afford that in New York City, I have no idea. And you will also see a picture of Joan Crawford. He loved Joan Crawford. And I just didn't think it would be true to Frank to not indicate his relationship with Jimmy on there somewhere. And, well, I like to think that that's Frank and Jimmy standing under that umbrella. And, the fact that it's a rainbow umbrella that, kind of fits in with the rights movement. Just these two guys, casual, obviously comfortable with one another. Jimmy would also die from AIDS after Frank. And he may never have a panel of his own. I don't know that I knew him well enough to be able to do that for him, but at least he's remembered here. Anybody that knew Frank, I think they will appreciate that.
When we had the March on Washington in April '93, and they were bringing the quilts, it was shocking for me. I was surprised. Joyous, but also surprised. They said there were probably a couple 100,000 of us there that day. It was 1 million people, easily. Because it wasn't just the quilt on the mall. It was a protest. It was a militant protest. We were shouting at the White House, "Shame! Shame!" The California contingent alone was bigger than a DC full gay pride festival. Every hotel in the city was gone, taken. And there were like 2 major groups. There was love on the mall with the quilt and anger in the streets. These were the militant silence equals death crowd. They're angry because the medicines aren't getting out. And they're saying, we need the medicines. Expedite the medicines. We are dying. Is there a policy? Is there? Come on, government. Stand behind us. Give us some money. Get the scientists going. Do what you gotta do. So there's that. And there's the throwing of the balloons with the blood in them. So while all of that's happening, on the other side of the mall are the quilts. And with the quilts are the family members. These weren't the silence equals death people. They were the friends and family who were coming behind us and were our reinforcements. And they're saying, these are our sons and daughters. Get it together. So now, it wasn't just our fight. It was our friends' fight, and our sisters, and our high school classmates. And people were coming out, and they saw the quilts, and they say, oh shit, this really is happening. And so with those reinforcements, everything changed. It really did change. And the quilt side and the militant side mushed together. And suddenly we had a more coordinated, smarter way of going about things. We weren't just banging our heads against the wall. We actually had a plan of attack. And we had brilliant lawyers and other people outside our community. We were losing our captains and we were dying. And so the reinforcements came and they were our brothers and sisters. And I really mean our brothers and sisters. I mean the lesbian community and grandma and grandpa And Grandma's there making a quilt for her grandson's lover, or for her grandson. And she takes that experience, and now she's a voice back home, talking to her political leaders, talking to city council, saying this is happening. So the quilt became a tool for change, and it helped. It helped an awful lot.
Then he started declining, like really fast.
January 10th is when he went to the hospital.
And I mean, he was only 65, and he was a very active person. I mean, he was just such an extremely alive person. I mean, he loved people, but he was born the day after Christmas in 1941, and he died in February.
February 27th.
Yeah. And, well, we knew how he wanted one, a quilt. We had gone to, in DC, the first time the quilt was ever completely laid out on the wall. And so, well, I knew he wanted a panel, but we just never got it together until they did this quilt workshop in 2019.
It's not simple, you know, if anything, it is not simple. I know that people looked at our storefront at the Names Project as just a place with a bunch of sewing machines and a bunch of fabric, and while that's true, that's not what went on behind the doors. I mean, it isn't, but, you know, because when a person or a family would come in, you know, there were tears and there was laughter, but it was mostly a kind of grief counseling and sitting with someone in their pain, and a lot of people who came weren't ready, and we would never push those people. We would say, absolutely, you know, you go home, you sit with it, and if and when you're ready to do this, you know that we're here for you. And that's all they really wanted to hear. Now, the reason I haven't, and you may be asking yourselves, why haven't you made a panel yet for David? And it's because his 16-year partner isn't ready. He doesn't want to. And, you know, that is up to him. And, you know, I have, you know, all I've done is reach out to him and say, if and when you want to do this, you know that I will sew it for you, and it would be an honor. And he says, I know that, and I hear you. It's just I'm not there yet, and I get that.
First year we laid out the panels in Washington, we had 1,920. 88 was 8,288. 89, 12,040. 92, 20,600. And in 96 we had 44,000. But now we have, now we have over 54,000 panels. But I've always thought of it as being little. I've always thought of it that way because there's just so many more people that died. It is large, it is, but it could be so much bigger. I believe in just the United States, not the world, that it's only 14% of deaths. So, you know, when people look at it, and it is big, but it isn't, you know, it's hard. It gets me through every day. And I talk about the quilt. It makes me happy in a weird way. I get to love my friends. And I love my friends. They built me, kind of, you know, and I like me. And I have them to thank for that. I was lucky. I was one of the lucky ones because I found the quilt. And a lot of people are afraid of the quilt because it makes them sad. It does the opposite for me. It brings me comfort. And I just love it. It saved my life in many ways. We actually didn't have a funeral for Jerry, or I should say his family. He didn't want one, we didn't do one. What we did do, while he was still alive, though
He was unconscious at the time as we took well, this was someone else's idea. One of his friends took a bowl that was fireproof. And we all wrote what we wanted to say to Jerry on a note. And we took those notes and we put them in the bowl and we lit it on fire. But I still wanted to honor Jerry, you know, and so when I had finished the panel, I decided to walk it in the Pride Parade. So the big Pride celebration they have in San Francisco. So 3 of us who had finished our panels walked in the parade, and it was somber as we walked by. There were a lot of respects, but cheerful, you know, thank you, that sort of respect, and it was good. And Jerry really liked that parade. So it just seemed an appropriate way to honor him and complete the process of making the panel for him. And it was pretty amazing. And that's when it became emotional. It felt like an acknowledgement of a time now past and a remembrance of a beautiful person.
I feel like my mom's quilt is a statement for HIV awareness, especially to Black women. And of course, we advocate for all. We want everyone to have access to resources and care and to be treated with dignity so that they can have a quality of life. And so it speaks to our initial intent with the disproportionate rate in Black women specifically, because in our experience, they just get lost in the shuffle. 3 to 4 new diagnoses in women who are impacted by HIV are Black women, but they tend to be silent. They tend to spend time and care for others and compromising themselves and their relationships and just get shuffled and just lost. And so this image is just like speaking out loud, you know? We are here. And we are also a part of this epidemic. And here I am.
The image on the panel is from the church in Assisi, because that's the first place we rendezvous. He had to go see it for class, and I was like, I'll meet you there. And the image on the panel, the central image, is from the Deposition of Christ on the Cross. It's a fresco by Pietro Lorenzetti, and it's located in the lower basilica in St. Francis in Assisi. And what I did was, it's sort of like a Pieta image, and what I did was I printed this all out into a heavy muslin. And then I went over and I painted it by hand. Then I went back again, I painted over all the auras and halos. Christ being cradled by the Virgin. I like the image. And it very much makes me think of Craig because Craig died. And he died in 1991. And I'm pretty sure his family was accepting, at least within the family, maybe not. But I know there was an awful lot of talk about his death back home in Paris, Texas. It was all this homophobic. And so I know he got zero sympathy from the folks back home as he lay dying. And so it makes me think of Christ and the Virgin.
When my partner, Edith, got sick with cancer in 1975, Hector was just always there. He would always come over and spend time with her so I could go out, get away for a little bit. And he would always come to the hospital and bring Cuban coffee and Cuban pastries, because in San Francisco there were a lot of Cuban bakeries. And then he would just make sure I got home okay at night after taking Edith to the hospital, which he had to do a lot there towards the end. But Hector was just there for me. And then we lost Edith to cancer in 1980. And then Hector got sick from HIV. At some point, I will be taking their ashes back to Cuba because they both requested that. Hector had a beautiful smile. He loved to smoke a Cuban cigar, and he made you really feel like you were really his friend and that he was there for you. He really was just there for me when my partner was dying. You know? He was there for us.
Well, there is a bookshelf because he was a librarian. Well, okay, I shouldn't say it like that. It's not like libraries are just books or whatever, but I mean, he loved books. He loved to read.
Yeah, I remember when he bought his first house and completely filled it with books.
Yeah. And he was also a member of HRC.
The Human Rights Campaign.
And he loved coffee. Oh my God, totally into coffee. And, you know, he also just loved window light. So we put a window with the sun coming in. And then he had a ton of those prisms. So we put a prism on it.
Yeah, there's a literal prism, a crystal on there.
And then we had the rainbow colors coming out of that. And then he had plants everywhere. And you will see the names of our core family. So Erin, Lisa, Jim is my spouse, but he's been in my life for 100 million years. And, you know, he loved Dad, and Dad loved him.
Yeah, and Emma, my daughter, he loved Emma. Loved her.
And then, when he retired, Erin got him a dog, and he fell in love. Oh my God. I mean, it was just crazy. And so, you know, we had to put a picture of him and Bailey there, and yeah, that's about it.
What I really hope to impress is just how big an impact HIV had on this person. And multiply that by millions, maybe. It's transformed the way society functions. And I just want people to know that maybe getting over the horror of so many people's deaths, it profoundly colors my life permanently and currently in my relationships with everybody. It's made me grateful in a way that most people don't experience until late in life, you know, when they're losing their friends to old age. I lost a generation at a young age, and it made me realize and appreciate the beauty of life and existence. It's made me grateful in a way. It's not a long period of time in a given lifetime. It's not a long period of time in the scheme of things. And I don't know. I really appreciate the beauty of existing because of that.
It's over like hope. It was unnecessary. didn't have to be like this. Our healthcare system doesn't have to be like this. You know, we didn't have to have someone in the Oval Office who couldn't even speak the name of AIDS, who didn't even give a flip about the men that were dying. There were so many components of this that were just unnecessary. And like David, there are still so many names that are not represented by the quilt. Part of the role of the memorial is to say that this is just a fraction. You know, this is just, in other words, the quilt is giving those men and the people we don't know about who've passed away from AIDS a face and a voice and a life after death. In a way, it's a lifting up those who could not have that voice, who could not be represented. It's a lifting up of the whole.